so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Warren Milteer, and I teach at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro in the history department, and I'm going to serve as the chair of this panel. I just want to go through and introduce each of our speakers. The speakers will be speaking in the order that they appear in the program. For sake of time, I'm going to give you just a brief intro. So our first speaker will be Elizabeth Neidenbach, and she is currently the visitor service trainer at the Historic New Orleans Collection, and is also currently revising a book manuscript. She received her PhD and master's degrees in American Studies at the College of William and Mary. Our second presenter is Jari, Honora, and he is a New Orleans native and is a graduate of Tulane University. He works as the reference associate for the Historic New Orleans Collection and is a professional genealogist. Our third presenter is Mishio Yamanaka, who is an assistant professor at the International Institute of American Studies at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. And she is a graduate of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's PhD program in history, and also has a graduate certificate in digital humanities. She is also working on a book manuscript based on her dissertation research about Creoles of color in New Orleans during Reconstruction. And our commentator for today is Petra Munro Hendry, and she is the St. Bernard chapter of the LSU Alumni Association, endowed professor emeritus in the School of Education at LSU. So we'll go ahead and I'll pass it on to you, Libby.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully without any issues.
Other speakers might want to mute their mics while the first presentation takes place.
All right. On November 12, 1832, Marie Justine Cernier, widow Couvent, dictated her will to a notary in her New Orleans home. This free woman of color left property to family and friends, but her greatest bequest extended to her community when she declared that, quote, "My land at the corner of Grand Zulm and Union Streets be forever dedicated and employed for the establishment of a free school for the orphans of color of the Faubourg Marigny." In an effort to guarantee the creation of a school and its continuous existence on her land, Couvent placed it under the auspices of the Catholic Church. She also specified that the land, quote, "never be sold." Upon approving the will's contents, Couvent made her ordinary mark. Despite being unable to sign her own name, Couvent understood the importance of education and envisioned her land utilized for that purpose. She left a legacy both material and conceptual. Couvent donated her most valuable piece of property in the Faubourg Marigny neighborhood for a school and indicated the specific type of school to be created, one that provided a free education to the most vulnerable in her community and had connections to the Catholic Church. Through her forward-thinking bequest, Couvent endowed future generations of children with an education. But more than just a charitable donation, Couvant's bequest was a political act. White New Orleanians restricted Black people's access to education as part of a system of enslavement and control. Couvant's decision to leave her property for a school recognized this link between education and power. Although teaching free people of color remained legal, children who lacked the resources had limited opportunities to attend school. Couvent sought to broaden educational opportunities for free Black boys and girls, as access to state-sponsored free education was expanding but also becoming racialized. Her desire that the school exist in perpetuity anticipated Black New Orleanians' ongoing struggle to gain equitable access to education in the city. Now, as a bequest, Couvant's mandate required the efforts of other people to bring it to fruition. A group of free men of color, led by the wealthy entrepreneur Francois Lacroix, put her last wishes into effect when they founded l'Institution Catholique des Orphelins Indigents in 1847. The Catholic institution, as I will refer to it, quickly became the leading school for free Black children in the decade before the Civil War. Although connected to the Catholic Church, free men and women of color staffed and managed the school. Orphans and poor students attended for free, while others paid a monthly tuition. Rodolphe Desdunes, a former student and member of the school's board of directors, described the Catholic institution as, quote, the best school to attend during the time of slavery. The corner of Grands Hommes and Union, now Dauphine and Tourreau Streets, remained a site for African-American education long after slavery ended. In 1994, the Society of St. Edmund, a Catholic religious order, opened Bishop Perry Middle School in the former Holy Redeemer Elementary School building on the land that once belonged to Couvent. With its stated mission to support and educate low-income Black boys through a free Catholic education, Bishop Perry brought Couvant's vision for her property full circle. Marie-Justine Sterner-Couvant's enduring legacy illustrates the way in which French-speaking free people of color and their Creole descendants transformed an urban lot into a significant place of education and political activism in New Orleans. The Catholic institution served as an important crucible of leadership for the Afro-Creole community during a period that spanned the turbulent 1850s, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the dawn of the Jim Crow era. Free people of color and their descendants administered the school during this time. After 1915, the school gradually came under the control of the Catholic Church, but it continued to serve African American children and foster political activism. With a focus on key moments in the school's history, from its founding in 1847 to its 21st century iteration as Bishop Perry Middle School, this paper demonstrates how New Orleanians of African descent used one free woman of color's bequest of land in the antebellum period to collectively confront changes in the city's political landscape over a century and a half. So Marie-Justine Sterner was born in Africa around 1757, enslaved as a child, and shipped to the French colony of Saint-Domingue from the Bight of Benin in the early 1760s. Sterner grew up enslaved in the port city of Cap Français, where she eventually gained her freedom. During the Haitian Revolution, she fled the island and resettled in New Orleans around 1804. Sterner quickly became a property owner, investing in land and enslaved people. In 1806, she bought two pieces of land. The first lot, which became the site of the school, was located in the Faubourg Marigny, a new suburb on the downriver side of the city, created from Bernard Marigny's plantation in 1805. Sterner resided on the second lot, located on Barrack Street in the French Quarter, for the next 30 years. In 1812, Sterner married a formerly enslaved man named Bernard Couvent. She outlived her husband by 8 years. When Couvent died in 1837, she'd accumulated an estate worth over $19,000, and her land made up almost 80% of that value. With her real estate purchases, Couvent joined a growing number of free Black landowners in New Orleans. Economic growth after the Louisiana Purchase offered increased opportunities for free Black individuals to acquire property and settle new neighborhoods like the Faubourg Marigny. Owning land offered free people of color a direct means to claim space for themselves in the city. Free Black residents bought property in order to secure their individual well-being, but also to protect and further develop common interests through collective institutions. Couvant's decision to leave her land for a school acknowledged both her ties to a broader free Black community and the value of property to supporting that community. On April 20th, 1847, 10 free men of color incorporated as a society to establish and administer the Catholic institution. These men were all literate property owners, and most of them lived in the Marigny. As the school's inaugural board of directors, they assumed administration of Couvant's land as their first order of business. The Catholic institution opened in 1848, and by 1853, 240 students attended the school. Although success marked its first decade of existence, the Catholic institution operated in an environment increasingly hostile to free people of color. As national debates over slavery intensified, white Louisianians, the growing fear of the free Black population led to repressive legislation and increased enforcement of existing restrictions, and in some cases, violence. Protected by its connection to the Catholic Church, the school served as an anchor for the French-speaking free people of color community throughout the 1850s. Indeed, the school's very existence challenged the racist presumptions of Black inferiority that white people used to justify slavery, severely restrict the rights of free people of color, and deny citizenship to all people of African descent. The school also provided a space where free people of color advanced their intellectual, cultural, and political development and honed their leadership skills. Principal Armand Lanous oversaw a talented teaching staff comprised of prominent free Black writers, intellectuals, and activists. The curriculum provided, quote, a practical, moral, and religious education. The teachers also inculcated a distinct political and racial consciousness in their pupils, as Mary Nile Mitchell has argued, looking to the broader Atlantic world for examples of citizenship and opportunity for people of African descent. This learning environment fostered aspirations to live in a world free of racial inequalities. When Union troops arrived in New Orleans in 1862, those hopes became real possibilities. Freemen of color connected to the Catholic institution led the fight for political and civil rights for people of African descent throughout the war and during Reconstruction. As editor of 2 newspapers during the 1860s, teacher Paul Trevine, for example, espoused a radical vision of a new nation where freedom and equality for all men replaced slavery and discrimination. Believing education to be a cornerstone in the fight to end racial prejudice, these activists helped pass a new state constitution in 1868 that included integrated public schools. The ascendancy of white Democrats following the Compromise of 1877, however, brought an end to school integration. By the early 1880s, just a few rundown buildings sufficed as Black schools in the downtown faubourgs, and the all-white school board ended education for African-American students at the 6th grade. Faced with these grim circumstances, a new slate of board members, including Rodolphe Desdunes, revitalized the Catholic institution between 1882 and 1884. The Archdiocese unsuccessfully attempted to reclaim the property during this time. The erection of a new building at the corner of Grands Hommes and Union Streets in 1894 marked the board's victory to maintain the school. Quote, by their integrity and dedication, Desdunes wrote in 1911, these Creoles were able to inaugurate a new era of prosperity and independence for the institution. In the 1880s and 1890s, Creole activists also continued to organize against laws and practices that sought to separate people by color, limit Black political participation, and uphold white supremacy. When the state legislature passed a bill for segregated trains in 1890, a group of 18 activists formed the Citizens Committee in 1891 to set up a case to test the constitutionality of the separate car law. Their coordinated challenge to racial segregation reached the United States Supreme Court in the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson. Several of the committee members, like Rodolphe Desdunes, had connections to the Catholic institution. Arthur Estève served as president of both the committee and the school board of directors. Louis Joubert, Louis A. Martinet, and Eugene Lucy served on the board. Firmin Christophe taught there. Desdunes' defiant and passionate editorials denouncing segregation laws reveal the full impact of the political lessons imparted to Catholic institution students by teachers like Armand Lanous and Paul Trevine. Although the struggle to realize their vision of a society built on equality and free of racial prejudice fell short, it left a powerful legacy to future Black activists. As a gesture towards nurturing the next generation of leaders, the Citizens Committee donated leftover funds to the Catholic institution following their case's defeat. The 20th century marked a gradual change in the administration and control of the Catholic institution. White Catholic clergy replaced the Creole-dominated teaching staff and board of directors over time, and the school eventually became attached to a parish. New names for the school accompanied these administrative adjustments. Financial difficulties were the immediate cause of these changes, but the school's evolution also stemmed from increasing segregation in all arenas of daily life. Between 1895 and 1920, the Archdiocese of New Orleans realigned its churches, parishes, and parochial schools to accommodate segregation. The first significant change to affect the Catholic institution occurred in this setting. In 1915, a hurricane demolished the school building. When fundraising to rebuild fell short, the board of directors solicited financial assistance from Catherine Drexel, the founder of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, a white order of nuns that administered to African Americans and helped fund separate Black parishes in New Orleans. The board maintained control of the school, but Drexel required that it be overseen by a white Josephite priest, staffed by her nuns, and renamed St. Louis. The school name change signified a break from the school's long history as an institution for children of color run by people of African descent. Despite the board of directors' diminished influence, it still had the authority and determination to repel another effort by the archdiocese to take over the school. In 1920, the board requested access to a bequest left to the school for a playground. The archbishop agreed to turn over the money only if the board relinquished its power. The directors adamantly refused, quote, to surrender their rights, declaring that they, quote, felt it a duty of their race to maintain the board. While the archbishop withheld the bequest, the directors retained their position as supervisors of the St. Louis School for another quarter century. The Great Depression caused additional financial strains that once again led to changes in the school's administration. By 1932, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament could no longer afford to support the St. Louis School, but operations continued through the assistance of another female order. By 1945, the St. Louis School was completely insolvent. To remain open, St. Louis became the parochial school for the nearby Holy Redeemer Church. And this reorganization dissolved the all-Black board of directors. The St. Louis School's relationship with Holy Redeemer Parish brought financial stability and improved infrastructure. The building constructed in 1917 needed major repairs, and the size of the student body required additional space. By the 1950s, over 600 children attended the school. Sixth grader Marilyn Medley described the, quote, small and overcrowded classrooms as, quote, dark and dreary with holes in the walls and broken windows. In 1956, Holy Redeemer constructed a modern, well-equipped three-story building on the corner of Dauphine and Touré Streets. After a century, the school's list of benefactors had grown long, but Medley recognized the significance of Marie-Justine Serner-Couvant's original bequest. She wrote, quote, my school is more than just a school. It is a monument to the dream of a wonderful woman, Marie Couvent. I know that she must be just as proud of my school as I am. For white people in the Faubourg-Marigny, the school also represented something more than just a school. By 1956, Black civil rights activists had met with preliminary success in the fight to desegregate New Orleans public schools. As white hostility towards integration efforts increased, the Holy Redeemer Rebuilding Project met with resistance from white neighbors. Critics of the new building, quote, complained the school brought Negroes into an essentially white neighborhood. The protesters' rhetoric followed an established pattern. As Walter Stern has described, white New Orleanians linked the racial identification of a school to that of the neighborhood. According to their logic, a Black school could not exist where white people lived. While opposition to the planned school did reflect demographic shifts that had occurred in the Marigny since the mid-19th century, it conveniently ignored the fact that a school for Black children had existed on that same corner for over 100 years. New Orleans Catholic schools integrated in 1962, but by 1965, school desegregation overall remained mostly symbolic. When Hurricane Betsy hit the city that year, it destroyed Holy Redeemer Church. The school, however, survived and came under the control of the Archdiocese. For the next 30 years, it operated as Holy Redeemer Elementary. The Archdiocese closed the school in 1994 due to declining attendance, but the building reopened for this next school year as Bishop Perry Middle School. In its most basic goals, the Edmondite program at Bishop Perry shared Couvant's original vision for providing a free education to Black youth. The school also evoked the Catholic institution in its curriculum, providing its pupils with a liberal arts education that emphasized leadership skills, quote-unquote Christian values, and, quote, an awareness and an understanding of their African-American heritage. Like all three previous incarnations of the school, Bishop Perry relied on outside funding sources to operate. A 5-year business plan from 2000 identified challenges to achieving its goals, but it could not predict this devastation of Hurricane Katrina. Bishop Perry reopened for a brief time after the storm, but many of its students and local donors had been displaced in the aftermath. Lacking the funds to continue, it closed permanently in 2006. In 1832, Marie-Justine Serner-Couvent instructed that her corner lot in the Faubourg-Marigny forever be utilized for a school. This charge was kept for over 150 years, despite financial stress and natural disasters, war, and political upheaval. During that time, thousands of African-American children received an education, often for free. The remarkable endurance of the site as a school for Black students is a testament to the vision of an illiterate, formerly enslaved woman, The tireless efforts of generations of people of African descent determined to provide their children with an education, and the compassion of white Catholic priests and nuns who offered their services and monetary support to keep the school open. For the people of color and their Creole descendants, the Catholic institution was a place where a community cultivated activists. Couvant's bequest allowed Creole leaders to translate a shared value of learning into an actual education program. Although the Catholic institution gradually evolved into a parochial school, it continued to provide an education to Black children at a time when conditions in the public schools were dismal at best. As Bishop Perry Middle School, the corner of Dauphine and Tureau again housed an institution that served, quote, the neediest of New Orleans sons. More than simply a plot of real estate or a school building, Marie Couvant's land in the Marigny serves as a site of memory, a place that embodies her legacy as a benefactor of education for children of African descent in New Orleans. Thank you. That work?
All right. Next up is Jari Honora.
Well, good morning to my co-panelists and to all of those who have gathered for our panel this morning. Let me just start by saying it's a pleasure to sit on this panel as I believe the only Catholic Creole on the panel, and as a product of Josephite education that we will hear about later, and who served in the Holy Redeemer Parish that Dr. Neidenbach mentioned. The preeminent African-American historian Carter G. Woodson wrote in 1919 that the accounts of the successful strivings of Negroes for enlightenment under the most adverse circumstances read like the beautiful romances of a people in a heroic age. In the historical period known as Reconstruction, a host of protagonists emerged to take on the heroic role of educating freedmen in the South. It included former soldiers and Union men who formed that government of men, as Du Bois called it, that was the Freedmen's Bureau. It included Northern missionaries under the auspices of the American Missionary Association and the American Baptist Home Mission Society, who ventured south to provide academic and religious instruction. And it also included people of color themselves, some free before the war, and others newly emancipated, but who in some way had managed to obtain literacy and a sufficient degree of education to teach others. However, absent from our general understanding of the educational landscape in that period are individuals like the Francophone free men and women of color who conducted the Catholic Indigent Orphans Institute, or the Sisters of the Holy Family, the antebellum free women of color who formed a religious community with the mission of educating and nursing their people. And also absent are individuals like the subject of this paper, Medard Nelson, who obtained an education under the auspices of the church and conducted schools and other institutions under the aegis of the Catholic Church. Medard Nelson was born on June 8, 1850, in rural St. John the Baptist civil parish, about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans. His mother, Marianne Eglé, was one of 124 enslaved people enumerated that very year as the enslaved property of Jean-Jacques Hilaire, a Louisiana Creole planter. Shortly after his birth, young Médard was baptized and given the name of the 6th century bishop on whose feast day he was born, June 8th. In the mid-1850s, Jean-Jacques Hilaire lost many of his enslaved people, as well as his wife, in a cholera outbreak and moved permanently to the city of New Orleans. It was in New Orleans, in and around the Vieux Carré, where young Medard Nelson showed great piety and intelligence and gained the friendship of the clerics who lived in and visited L'Archevêché, the Archbishop's residence, located in the old Ursuline convent attached to St. Mary's Church on Charter Street. Eventually, Nelson obtained the position of sacristan, making him a permanent fixture in St. Mary's Church. From April of 1866 to March of 1871, a period of 5 years, His name appears almost daily as a witness to marriages celebrated in St. Mary's Church. His biography, published by a grandson in 1987, corroborates that it was in 1866, when he became sacristan at the age of 16, that Medard Nelson expressed in earnest a calling to the priesthood. This decision came at the very time that the Most Reverend Jean-Marie Audin, the Archbishop of New Orleans, made plans to establish a diocesan seminary just beside the archiepiscopal residence. This institution, St. Mary's Ecclesiastical Seminary, under the supervision of the Irish-born Father John Hannigan and later Father Gilbert Raymond, the French-born priest who served for many years as chaplain to the Sisters of the Holy Family, included students from a variety of backgrounds. In the 1870 federal census, Médard is not listed with his family, but rather in the Archbishop's residence, immediately after the 9 ecclesiastical students who hailed from France, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. Nelson is listed as a domestic servant, likely because the temperament of the times necessitated that he not be identified formally as a student in the seminary, but rather as a laborer. At this juncture, it is important to note that while Medard Nelson's early consideration for seminary was unique, his experience was not. There are numerous examples of pious men and women of color, both before and after the Civil War, who lived with, worked for, and embraced the lifestyles of clerics and religious communities, but were not permitted to formally pursue religious life. His story is most similar to that of his contemporary, Father Augustus Tolton, born in 1854, a former slave, who likewise befriended several priests and was given private instruction by them before gaining admission to a seminary, although to one outside of the United States, the Seminary of the Congregation for the Propagation of Faith in Rome. Father Tolton was ordained in 1886 as the first identified African-American priest, and his cause for canonization was opened 11 years ago by the Archdiocese of Chicago. Nelson's chance to seriously pursue his religious vocation came in early 1872. At that time, the Reverend Dr. Herbert Vaughan of Mill Hill, England, made his way to New Orleans while on a tour of southern and midwestern cities, hoping to expand the work of his newly founded Society of St. Joseph for Foreign Missions to include Catholics of color in the United States. On April 6, 1872, the Most Reverend Napoleon Joseph Perche, the third Archbishop whom young Médard had known, wrote a formal letter of introduction, which he gave to Médard to present to Father Vaughan at Baltimore. In the letter, Archbishop Perche reminded Vaughan of his having met Nelson while in New Orleans. He noted that he had known Nelson since he was a little boy and always found him to be, quote, steady, docile, and pious. He was confident that the, quote, moral and religious young man would profit from his past studies and be able to progress towards ordination. A month later, on May 17, 1872, Father Vaughan wrote to Father Cornelius Dowling, the American rector of the Mill Hill Fathers, that he would receive Nelson into their seminary if he could raise the money necessary for his passage in his first years of studies. He suggested that Nelson remain in Baltimore and write to friends and acquaintances in order to raise the necessary funds. Médard did reside in Baltimore, becoming better acquainted with Father Dowling and continuing his studies. One of his obituaries notes that he studied at the famed St. Mary's Seminary under the Sulpician Fathers in Baltimore. However, a search of the seminary archives yielded no results. While no conclusive evidence can be found, his obituaries, his biography, and the oral tradition of his family all indicate that he pursued seminary studies in Europe, which ended with the death of both of his parents and his return to New Orleans to care for younger siblings. Indeed, his father died in New Orleans on 11 January 1872, and just a few months later, his mother died on July 13, 1872. Medard Hilaire Nelson is listed for the first time in the New Orleans City Directory in 1874, as operating a private school within his residence. This simple listing marks Nelson's decision to serve what he perceived as the greater public good. He had resolved what his grandson Joseph Arsenault quite eloquently called the inward conflict of a beneficial vocation. During the tumultuous period of Reconstruction, less than a decade after the end of slavery, and less than a decade after his own manumission from slavery, Medard Nelson saw his life's work as having a more Catholic impact in the classroom rather than at the altar. Nelson's school was just one of many small private Catholic institutions which existed in New Orleans and throughout the Gulf Coast region. Prior to the regular establishment of parochial schools, Catholic parents, who were admonished not to send their children to public institutions, relied upon schools run by religious communities of men and women and by lay people. While there were certain religious communities like the Ursulines, the Carmelites, and the Religious of the Sacred Heart who ran schools for children of color, the Sisters of the Holy Family remained the only religious community to include the exclusive instruction of children of color within their ministry. Lay men and women like Medard Nelson, who possessed a sufficient degree of education to teach and who were able to give catechetical instruction, often received students in their homes or in another location, as he did throughout New Orleans French Quarter for 13 years. On January 12, 1878, 6 years after he began teaching, Médard entered his familiar St. Mary's Church, where he was married to Marie Ned by his former instructor, Father Gilbert Raymond. Together they would have 9 children, 8 of whom would live to adulthood, and 1 of whom would follow his father's footsteps as a Josephite seminarian. On December 3, 1887, Médard purchased the home and the dependent structures at 1218 Burgundy Street that would serve as home and school for the next 46 years. It was in those buildings on Burgundy Street, which still stand, that Nelson educated hundreds of New Orleanians, black and white, immigrant and native born, rich and poor, old and young alike. Though like most school teachers of the era, he was formally styled Professor Nelson, he was known familiarly throughout the city as Professor Médard. From accounts of his former students, obituaries, and occasional newspaper reference, and his extant roll book, we can paint an accurate picture of the methodology and the instruction offered in the Nelson School. Firmly committed to the cause of education, and much like the Catholic Institution for Indigent Orphans, instruction was offered to all, regardless of their ability to pay. Médard was active in 2 benevolent organizations, the Société d'économie, or Economy Society, and the Société des Enfants de Saint Benoît, the Society of the Children of St. Benedict, the latter of which regularly gave Médard a contribution to cover the costs of students who could not afford to pay. Among his early students were individuals who were adults and likely ex-slaves. Within his extant roll book, which dates from 1877 to 1898 and kept entirely in French, there are students identified by only a first name and a title of Monsieur or Madame. One of these individuals, Madame Françoise Beausine, the widow of a man who had served in the United States colored troops in the Union Army, was in his 80s, entered school in her 90s, and was perhaps one of the oldest students that Médard taught. Recalling also the high mortality rate at that time, there are several notations of students like Laurette, who entered school in February 1878, and by April was listed as décédé, dead. Monsieur Médard's students came from all sections of the city. For example, Clément and Joseph Geddes, the scions of an uptown Catholic family of successful undertakers, Octave Bocage, who came from a family of boat builders in Algiers, and a young boy from the nearby Faubourg Tremé by the name of Alexander Pierre Thureau, who later became Louisiana's leading civil rights attorney. Perhaps most interesting is the fact that Médard's school was completely integrated. He taught both whites and blacks with no distinction made to race. Pauline Guiguel, for example, was a widowed white woman in her 50s when she entered the school in 1878. In the late 1880s, more and more names of Sicilian immigrant children can be found on the roll. It is from his work with these Italian immigrant children that, according to his biographer, he became acquainted with St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, whose convent and orphanage was also in the French Quarter. This is indeed remarkable that in a quiet and unassuming way, the Nelson School in the New Orleans French Quarter remained integrated at a time when Professor E.J. Edmonds, an accomplished instructor in the city's boys' high school, his appointment to teach in the city's boys' high school was violently protested, and girls were forcibly ejected from the nearby Lower Girls High School. It continued through the 1890s, and in fact, the numbers skew even more so towards integration in the 1890s, at the same time that his peer and fellow New Orleanian Homer Plessy fought unsuccessfully to challenge legalized segregation. Strict discipline and neatness of dress were insisted upon. He began each day with a check of students' hands and shoes to make sure they were clean. If a male student did not have a cravat or necktie, he kept ribbon on hand to tie around their necks. The rattan was the principal form of discipline in the school, and his grandson commented in 1987 that the rattan was effectively administered to all, white or black, a poignant scene that resonated with Joseph Arsenault, whose entire childhood and upbringing was during the period of Jim Crow segregation. The school included 10 years of instruction, equivalent to a high school and grammar school course of studies. Children were accepted as young as 4 years old, dependent upon their maturity. The school was open year-round, and students progressed at their own pace. If a subject was mastered sooner than expected, the individual was free to move on to another subject. There was early mastery of the rudiments, including penmanship, and instruction was given in French and English daily from the very first year to the last, with Latin and Greek 3 times a week in the 5th and 6th years of instruction. Between the 6th and 10th years, students mastered algebra, geometry, basic trigonometry, and learned bookkeeping 3 times a week. Ancient, modern, and Louisiana history, along with geography, comprised the social science curriculum. Interesting indeed must have been the lessons that Medard offered in Louisiana history, considering that he had practically been reared in what is the city's oldest building. He was of the, quote, old school, as the Daily Picayune wrote at the turn of the century, and did not believe in holding commencements, although he relented that year and held commencement exercises for the first time in 28 years in the hall of the Economy Society, of which he was a member. Though students eventually learned a few songs during their catechetical instruction, Médard was decidedly against including music in the curriculum, which is surprising considering that he taught numerous famed jazz musicians, including stringmen Danny Barker and George Gesnell, clarinetist George Lewis, and violinist Charles Elgar. Adult education was provided at night and consisted of the basic academic subjects, along with lessons in shorthand, typewriting, and single and double entry bookkeeping. Teachers in the local public school system often came to study foreign languages at night in order to obtain the proficiency to teach them. Perhaps the best known of these students was Professor George Carpenter, who enjoyed a long and successful career as a teacher of French in McDonough 35, the city's first public high school for Black students. Most of the courses were taught by Médard himself until his daughters and his oldest son Francis, who also followed him into the seminary of the Josephite Fathers, assisted him in teaching.
Your mic's off.
As a Catholic school, students were led in prayers 3 times daily. and catechism was taught on a daily basis. The school was regularly listed among the non-parochial Catholic schools that operated within the territory of St. Mary's Church and under the control of the local pastor. Like many private institutions, the Nelson School received regular episcopal visits from the Archbishop of New Orleans, particularly Archbishop Jansen's, just as though they were parochial schools. Older students read Old Testament history in Latin, and in preparation for First Communion, younger students studied basic Christian morality in French. A comparison of the 8th year curriculum from the Nelson School and a contemporary 8th grade curriculum from the schools of the Archdiocese shows that his students were advanced for their level of studies, and in reading, arithmetic, and composition were generally 3 years ahead of their peers. In 1925, when Medard Nelson was 75 years old, his wife died after 47 years of marriage. Though he continued to teach, the loss had a significant impact, and he began to relinquish some of the duties to his children. On June 9th, 1933, one day after his 83rd birthday, one day after the feast of the French bishop for whom he was named, Medard Hilaire Nelson died in his home and school on Burgundy Street, surrounded by children and grandchildren. For 61 years, he had dedicated his life to the cause of education. He recognized the unique opportunity he had been given as a freedman in the American South to obtain a solid academic and religious education and work to serve a universal population of students, both white and black, young and old, rich and poor. As a young man, he felt called by the words of Psalm 43, "I will go to the altar of God, who giveth joy to my youth." However, after reflection and discernment in the tumultuous period of post-Civil War New Orleans, he embraced Deuteronomy 6:7, "Teach diligently thy children, and talk of them when thou sittest in thy own house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." As a testament to his life's work, the Public School Board of New Orleans named the elementary school in his honor in 1939. Every successive generation of his family can count numerous Catholic educators, including 2 religious sisters. Upon the dedication of the Nelson Public Elementary School in 1939, his son, Dr. Joseph M. Nelson, perhaps summed up his life's work best. The education of children and of underprivileged persons, regardless of their racial identity, was dear to his heart. This was with him an obsession to which he devoted nearly 60 years of his life. Thank you.
All right, next up is Mishio Yamanaka. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, make sure you put those in the Q&A box.
All right, thank you, Warren. Let me share my little picture right here. Okay, let me start reading my paper. When Rodolphe Lucien de Dieu, a Creole man of color, activist, and writer, published a chronicle of his community as Nos Hommes et Notre Histoire in 1911, Arbor et Dupont, a publisher based in Montreal, printed his manuscript. Edward LaLocque Tinker speculated that no Louisiana-based printers would have taken de Dieu's work because he used the word Creole to describe persons of color. Racism was certainly an unbearable obstacle for somebody like de Dieu, who was well known as an outspoken critic of segregation laws before the loss of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson U.S. Supreme Court case. Yet my research shows that de Dieu chose the Montreal-based publisher specifically because he viewed French Canadians as allies. In the late 1900s and early 1910s, Creoles of color in New Orleans and French Canadians developed their friend relationship through St. Joseph's Society of Sacred Heart, better known as the Josephites, and nurtured the sense that they were Francophone minorities commonly oppressed by Anglophone-dominated North American societies. But this paper argues that their unity created an opportunity for Creoles of color to discuss the ordeal of the Jim Crow system to the Francophone Catholic population in Canada and in Europe. And furthermore, this paper demonstrates how this relationship contributed to the educational mission of the Josephites in Louisiana in the early 20th century. At the turn of the 20th century, the Josephites built a close relationship with Louisiana's Creoles of color in order to fulfill their mission to serve Black Catholics in the American South. Louisiana was a focal point of their missionary work because the proportion of Black Catholics was greater than any other states in the Deep South. In 1897, the Josephites appointed Pierre Oscar Louveau, a white Creole priest from Munro, to launch their first Louisiana mission, and Louveau founded the Immaculate Conception Church in Petit Prairie in St. Landry Parish. The Josephite found further opportunity to boost their work when the Archdiocese of New Orleans decided to increase the number of Blacks-only parishes in the city of New Orleans. In March 1909, the Archdiocese opened St. Dominic's Church in Carrollton, now Blessed Sacrament and St. Joan of Arc Church, as the city's second Blacks-only parish. Archbishop James Blank asked the Josephite to manage the operation of the church. And French Canadians were the key component of the Josephite mission at St. Dominic's Church, while Pierre Louveau took the lead as the principal pastor, so he moved from St. Landry Parish to St. Dominic's in New Orleans. But the St. Dominic's needed more Francophone workers, as many Black New Orleanians were French speakers who oftentimes were not fluent in English. For the Josephite, sending French-Canadian priests to their Louisiana mission was practical because they were Francophone whites who did not cause racial fear among white Louisianians. In fact, the Josephite had John Plantavigne, a Louisiana-born Creole priest of color, who repeatedly begged to be appointed to St. Dominic's, but they never accepted his request. In September 1910, instead of John Plantavigne, the Josephite appointed Pacifique Roy, a newly ordained Quebecois, to be the assistant pastor of St. Dominic's. Born in Saint Julien in 1885, he attended schools in Montreal and in Joliet before matriculating into Epiphany Apostolic College in Baltimore. The French-Canadian population of New Orleans was very small, numbering only 101 in the 1910 census. And perhaps because the community was so small, Roy was able to develop close-knit ties with them. And French-Canadian laypersons helped Roy manage the day-to-day operation of St. Dominic's Church, and they helped him reach out to the city's Creoles of color. And one of such French-Canadian laypersons was Louis Septime Laferrière, commonly known by his pseudonym Louis Martin. Born in Quebec in the 1870s, Martin grew up under the influence of Quebec nationalism and established his career as a journalist for La Presse in Montreal. He moved to New Orleans sometimes in the late 1900s and assumed a position as a record keeper at St. Louis Cathedral. While he assisted Roy at St. Dominic's, he developed interest in the Creole community in New Orleans, and he met numerous old Creole families of color, and at one point became friends with Rodolphe Lucien de Dune. Louis Martin wrote a preface to de Dune's Nos Hommes et Notre Histoire, and it demonstrates some critical elements that enabled French Canadians to bond with Creoles of color. First, Martin contended that the language was more important than racial difference. He wrote, quote, "I love the Creoles of color. I love him above all when he is speaking my language," end quote. Martin's father argued that skin color bore no relevance by saying, quote, "He is then somewhat a cousin of mine," end quote, and continued, quote, "As for the color of his skin, what does that matter?" End quote. And second, Martin was openly sickened by Jim Crow segregation and admired Creoles of color who fought against it. As a supporter of the Quebec nationalism movement, he overlapped Creole struggles with his own struggle against Anglo-Canadians. Martin praised how Creole men and women resisted the enforcement of Jim Crow laws. He wrote that in their suffering and resistance he, quote, "felt that truly there exists in them half of myself," end quote. In March 1911, Pacific Roy began publishing the bi-monthly French magazine titled L'Ami des Noirs, to carry on his mission to educate Black Catholics. Roy took the inspiration from the Société des Amis des Noirs, the French abolitionist group established in 1778, and French Canadians supported L'Ami des Noirs as contributors. As an established journalist, Louis Martin became one of the principal writers for the magazine. The magazine aimed to garner support from French Canadians and Europeans and relied on French Canadian religious networks to increase its subscribers. Notable French Canadian priests and politicians, such as former Montreal Mayor Alphonse Desjardins, financially contributed to the magazine. And in addition to readers in Quebec, French Canadian expats in New England and Michigan were subscribers. The magazine's existence was known among Belgian and French Catholic priests as well. And except for the inaugural issue, Roy printed L'Ami des Noirs through Herbert and Dupont, the company that Desdunes used to publish his Nos Hommes et Notre Histoire. The French Canadian Catholic community opened a channel for Creoles of color like Desdunes to publish his work for francophones outside of Louisiana. In L'Ami des Noirs, French Canadians openly problematized the Jim Crow South. Segregation perplexed French Canadians in their daily lives because a considerable number of mixed-race Creoles were labeled as Black in an arbitrary manner in their eyes. In the July 1911 issue of L'Ami des Noirs, Louis Martin wrote that he often failed to determine people's racial identities in the United States and added, quote, "This confusion takes place even more easily when one of these white Negroes comes to address him in French like in New Orleans," end quote. Because of their unfamiliarity with the Jim Crow system, some French Canadians got into trouble as well. In the January 1912 issue, Lucien Delille from Montreal described an incident in which he accidentally sat on an empty seat on the rear part of the streetcar in New Orleans. After a while, he noticed a sign, and the driver came up to him and ordered him to stand up. Delille summarized his experience as such, quote, "This green gallows symbolizes in my eyes a black question," end quote. French Canadians did not take the Jim Crow system as a norm, however. Louis Martin felt anger when he saw light-skinned Creoles of color in the segregated areas in the public. He commented, quote, "In Paris, they would shine in the front row, as did the poet Victor Séjour, the violinist Edmond Dede, and the inventor Rieu, and all the other descendants of Creoles who went to live there far from the persecution and of prejudice," end quote. French Canadians' consistent criticism towards segregation probably made Desdunes feel confident to vocalize his continuing anti-segregation sentiment in L'Ami des Noirs. After he had a work-related accident in 1911, he was nearly blind. Yet, in the January 1912 issue of L'Ami des Noirs, he published an article titled, quote, "Le Noir en Tramway," end quote. In it, Desdunes called streetcar segregation, quote, "a monstrosity," end quote, and complained about how white men casually control the space without the consideration of Black writers. Dune also made it clear that his community still did not tolerate segregation. One female student, according to Dune, preferred walking to her university to taking a streetcar. Dune contended, just like her, quote, "Today there is still the cry of protest from thousands of others, of us especially who feel the French blood warm up our hearts and who have been ennobled by the divine sacraments of the Catholic Church." Unquote. By using his new French-Canadian friendship, Dune found a venue to express his resistance to segregation. In L'Ami de Noir, French Canadians also wrote articles to support Josephite fathers' educational mission. French Canadians believed that the lack of education hindered Black Americans to be truly free. Paul Augustin, a French Canadian layperson who worked for Pacific Croix, discussed that Reconstruction failed due to the lack of education. In fact, the illiteracy rate among Black Louisianians was close to 50% in 1910. Augustin contended that, quote, "We do today what we should have done in 1865," end quote. Josephite fathers taught the congregants how to read and write at St. Dominic's Church in cooperation with the Sisters of the Holy Family. By 1912, approximately 100 students attended the parochial school. French Canadians continued their educational work after Roy was transferred to Immaculate Conception Church in St. Landry Parish in 1912. There, Roy brought Louis Martin and other French Canadians to organize day and evening classes which taught a wide range of subjects from reading to catechism and perhaps most importantly, French. In 1913, the school taught approximately 90 students. The relationship between Creoles of color in New Orleans and the French Canadians, however, did not last long. A lack of funding was a constant issue for Pacific Croix, and a few years after he moved to Immaculate Conception Church, he was no longer able to sustain the magazine. Louis Martin, the most vocal opponent of racial injustice among French Canadians, decided to leave Louisiana to join the French army when World War I broke out. He survived the war, but was unable to return to Louisiana. In 1920, he had an accident in London and died from a severe injury. It is unclear whether Rodolphe Lucien de Dune learned about the death of his friend. By then, he had left New Orleans to be with his son in Omaha, Nebraska. Roy's educational work, nevertheless, continued after the siege of L'Ami de Noir. A natural disaster and poverty were a persistent problem for the educational mission. When the town was flooded and many families had trouble sending children to the school, Roy helped them sell moss to New Orleans and Montreal. Roy worked at Immaculate Conception Church until 1927. So to conclude this paper, in this brief time period, Creoles of color enjoyed a unique relationship with French Canadians through their shared religion, language, and a sense of oppression. Creoles of color found this allyship a small refuge from the world dominated by Anglophones and the Jim Crow system. In this transnational Francophone community, Creoles of color like the Dune found a way to voice their dissent against the Jim Crow system and solidify their community pride as a Francophone group of color. Their friendship also contributed to continuing French education for Creole children in Louisiana. Thank you very much.
All right, and now we'll have our comment.
Well, first, I want to thank Libby for inviting me to be the discussant. It's been a pleasure to read these exceptionally well-researched papers that I find are groundbreaking in numerous ways. And I titled my comment. I gave it a title. It's called Retrieving Mislaid Memories. Cyprian Davis, in his 1990 groundbreaking work, The History of Black Catholics in the United States, proclaimed that, quote, the history of the Black Catholic community in the United States has never really been told. Too often the presence of Black Catholics through the centuries has been a muted one, a silent witness, an unspoken testimony. It is the historian's task to make the past speak, to highlight what has been hidden, and to retrieve a mislaid memory, end quote. The history of Black Catholicism is as old as Christianity, yet the history of Black Catholics in the United States, as Cyprian Davis suggests, has been muted. Southern Black Catholic history has suffered almost total neglect. Southern Black Catholic educational history has been impossible to make tangible given the ongoing legacy of white racial supremacy. The papers in this session seek to remedy this flagrant omission. This panel challenges historians to enlarge the scope not only of Black Catholic educational history, but also civil rights history and African American history. The stories told here require a reassessment of what counts as public education. Dominant histories of public education, beginning with the Common School movement in the 1840s, have in fact excluded anything other than state-supported education as public. Yet, the Black Catholic schools in these papers were, for all practical purposes, public schools, providing access to all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or class. These scholars provide a much-needed interrogation of the marginalization of Black Catholic education. They bring to light a different educational history, one in which Afro, Franco, Creole Catholics, mostly free people of color, but also enslaved peoples and their white allies as well, saw education as a public, universal right. Marie Couvent, Medard Nelson, and Pacifico Roy represent a long history of educational activism embedded within what Karen Causey Bell calls a transnational Afro-Creole, and I add Franco-Catholic, protest tradition. Three significant themes in these papers prompt us to revision the history of education. First is the French transatlantic nature of Black Catholic education. Second is the long history of Black Catholic education predating the Common School movement. And lastly, the role of interracial community networks across generations to sustain educational activism. In Libby's paper, the widow Couvent embodies not only a transatlantic odyssey, but her story reveals how she is an Afro-Creole free woman of color. Her story reveals how she, as an Afro-Creole free woman of color, navigated the patriarchal, racist, slaveholding terrain of antebellum New Orleans in order to establish an educational institution for the most marginalized children. Her odyssey, as chronicled by Libby, began in the Bight of Benin, where she was enslaved, then to Saint-Domingue, where she experienced the Haitian Revolution, and in 1804 she fled to New Orleans, where she was one of thousands of Haitian refugees. This influx of refugees doubled the population of New Orleans, reinvigorating not only the Catholic religion, but the French language as well. Like many other free people of color, Marie worked to establish and maintain her freedom through land ownership, establishing businesses, and building community networks between Afro-Creoles, French sympathizers, white allies, and Catholic clergy. Building these networks, I suggest, was in and of itself a form of social activism that was critical to creating public spaces like schools, Masonic lodges, mutual aid societies, and churches, in which those marginalized could demand recognition of their humanity. Given the increasing racial restrictions in the 1830s, these spaces became critical sites of self-determination. In 1832, well before public education was introduced to New Orleans, Couvent left provisions for a free school for Black orphans, signifying her understanding of the essential role of education in the quest for human equality. Much of the scholarship pertaining to Couvent has emphasized the role by the Catholic Church in the realization of Couvant's wishes. This top-down, male-dominated history has obscured the history of many free women of color as social activists, including Couvent, who played a central role in the struggle for public rights and who saw education as critical to ending racial prejudice. The school, when it finally opened in 1848, was, as Libby describes, quote, a space where free people of color advanced their intellectual, cultural, and political development and honed their leadership skills, end quote. Prominent Afro-Creole poets, artists, writers, and activists taught in French, providing a liberal arts curriculum in which students were empowered to expose and confront social injustices. Mary McNeil has maintained that the school was a nursery for revolution. Black children received not only an education, but were, as Libby described, quote, inculcated into a distinct political and racial consciousness, end quote, that sought freedom and full citizenship for all people. This political activism preceded the civil rights movement by over 100 years. While the school changed administrations under various iterations as described by Libby, it was under the leadership of an all-Black board of directors for over 100 years. This is a testament to the long Afro-Franco-Creole Catholic history of education, which Libby's important research is bringing to light. In Jari's paper, Medard Hilaire Nelson's life also embodies the transnational educational activism of the Afro-Franco-Creole Catholic protest tradition. Born 50 years after the French sold Louisiana to Jefferson, Médard was raised speaking French and attending St. Mary's Church at the Archbishop's residence in the French Quarter, originally the Ursuline Convent. He was called to the priesthood at a time when Black men were not admitted into American Catholic seminaries. However, this did not stop him or the French Catholic clergy from supporting him in his pursuit. By 1870, post-Civil War Catholics in New Orleans faced mounting challenges given the rapid development of Protestant institutions, as well as increasing pressure to give up their French language. Creoles of color, like Nelson, were also increasingly excluded from the political and social system of Louisiana society under Jim Crow. In this complex, racially oppressive environment, in which the American Catholic Church increasingly capitulated to white racial supremacy, it was the French transatlantic Catholic community that sought to uphold the Church's ideology of universalism. As Jari makes so abundantly clear, for young Nelson, any hope of becoming a priest was in the hands of these French clerics. Despite the increasing racial prejudice of the American Catholic Church, many French clergy opposed discrimination. Archbishop Pierce and head of the seminary, Father Gilbert Raymond, who also served as the priest for the Sisters of the Holy Family, were both French clerics who found ways in which to subvert the racial hierarchy of the post-Civil War era. A prime example, which Jari alludes to, is when the seminary listed Médard as a domestic servant instead of as a seminary student to evade the displeasure of white Southern racial norms and the increasingly segregationist policies of both the state and church. Once Nelson began his school, he also received ongoing support from the Catholic Church. While Nelson never became a priest, he devoted his entire life to the education of all children. Students as were pointed out, were admitted regardless of race, ethnicity, or ability to pay. Those students who could not pay were supported by a variety of sources, including the income from tuition, as well as donations from a variety of mutual aid and benevolent societies to which Nelson belonged, including the Société d'Économie, Economy Hall, and the Société des Enfants de Saint-Benoît. As Fatima Shak, in her recent book, Economy Hall, highlights, these mutual aid societies were critical spaces of self-determination and political agency. After the Civil War and the rise of Jim Crow, these societies became overt civil rights organizations. They provided not only money to Menard School to pay tuition, but they made available their halls for graduations, recitals, and community events. In other words, these societies themselves functioned as educational institutions, providing a vision of lifelong community education. Jari's research attunes us to the rich community networks of Afro-Creole teachers, French clerics, mutual aid societies, and African-American philanthropists who have long been neglected as a critical site of interracial educational activism. In Mishio's paper, we are introduced to another French Catholic transatlantic activist movement which emerged after the Civil War to address the educational needs of the formerly enslaved. The St. Joseph Society of Sacred Heart, known as the Josephites, was originally founded in 1871 in England as a missionary order. When the Civil War released thousands from slavery, the Josephites saw this as an opportunity to provide much needed education for African Americans. Archbishop Janssens, originally from the Netherlands of New Orleans, successfully recruited the French-speaking Josephites in the 1880s to rural Louisiana, where the dominant language among Afro-Creoles was still French. The shared use of the French language, according to Mishio, quote, nurtured the sense that they were Francophone minorities, commonly oppressed by Anglophone-dominated North American societies. This shared status as minorities eclipsed race as the sole source of discrimination. However, by the 1890s, the Catholic Church in Louisiana had established separate parish churches and schools for Blacks and whites. As Mishio's research suggests, not all Catholic clerics remained complicit in the system of oppression. French-Canadian Pacificois Roy, a Josephite brother, was recruited from Montreal to be the assistant pastor and administer the all-Black school, along with the Sisters of the Holy Family at St. Dominic's Church in Carrollton. A critic of segregation, he began publication of his bi-monthly French magazine entitled L'Ami de Noir in 1911 as a way to carry his mission to educate Black Catholics. As Mishio maintains, the magazine fashioned itself on a 1778 French abolitionist publication. French Canadians, New Orleanians, and other Europeans contributed articles which problematized the Jim Crow South. French Canadians in New Orleans, while a small number, contributed to the journal. This interracial, transatlantic Catholic publication decried not only segregation, but squarely addressed the unequal education received by Blacks in segregated New Orleans. For a brief period, the French-Canadian and Afro-Creole Catholic Alliance was critical to Black Catholics who, under the oppression of Jim Crow, sought ways to continue their activist struggle for educational and human universalism. The L'Ami des Noirs broadcasted the racism and oppression under which Blacks lived in the South to Canada and beyond, building critical alliances with those outside of the United States. These alliances provided spaces from which to imagine a full citizenship and support, both moral and financial, to continue the fight for equality. While short-lived, this alliance made possible the publication of Dedun's seminal work on the history and culture of Afro-Creoles in New Orleans. Without this pivotal work, a vast history would have remained undocumented. Mishio's research challenges educational historians to take note of the role transatlantic French-Canadian Afro-Creole Catholic networks played in combating racial discrimination. Catholic schools, like those of Professor Nelson, the Catholic Institute, and St. Dominic's, provided not only an education, but they provided students with a strong interracial, transnational community network that was dedicated to instilling in them a long history of Black Catholic educational activism. While individuals like Nelson, Marie Couvent, or Pacificoy Roy must be given credit, it is important to remember that these individuals were deeply embedded in community networks whose long histories of educational activism made possible their visions. So my questions and provocations to the panelists serve as prompts for further research and future projects. First, what is unique about Black Catholic education? It's more than a school. It's political. I think there's all sorts of implications if we look at really the philosophy and pedagogies of Black Catholic education. Secondly, how can historians take into account the complex, multiple intersecting sites of race, gender, ethnicity, class, place, and language in shaping educational narratives? And lastly, what are the implications of these histories for revisioning dominant narratives of educational history? Thank you. And I assume we're open for questions and discussion.
Yes. Did any of the speakers want to respond to the questions that were posed? All right, well, we'll go to audience questions. So Terry Dickerson says, excellent panel, thank you. And the question is, the panelists are referencing the period after Plessy during which Catholic segregation policies were adopted and expanded upon. What do they recommend as best sources of scholarship and or literature on the dates and wording of such Catholic policies?
There's a monograph on this by James Bennett called Religion and the Rise of Jim Crow in New Orleans from 2005. That's probably the place to start. He really mined the Archdiocese archives. And he talks about both on the Catholic side, but also I think Methodism on the Methodist side too, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I also recommend reading John B. Albert's Black Catholic Schools, the Josephite Parishes During the Jim Crow Era. I think it might be available online.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to type it. But do you have any recommendation? Any other?
I agree with the two sources that have been mentioned already, but I would just add for Mr. Dickerson that in many ways these policies, just like Walter Stern spoke of in his book dealing primarily with public schools, were neighborhood based, and the segregated nature of the church came from the very establishment of schools and churches that were either for white Catholics or for other groups of Catholics, and that Black Catholic churches have to be seen as a part of a broader movement of national parishes, where even in one community there would be parishes organized according to ethnic group or according to language group, so that you might have in a city like New Orleans or Chicago, for example, a single neighborhood with 4 or 5 Catholic churches less than 2 to 3 blocks apart, because each ethnic group required its own parochial church and parochial school. And so colored Catholics, as the term was then, fit into that mold just as much as German-speaking Catholics or Irish Catholics or any other group.
And Warren, I think we missed
No, that's
math.
that's not a question for us. He wants your contact information.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, happy to share that in the chat.
Yeah.
The project sounds really interesting, Matthew.
Yes.
Do we have any other audience questions? Did any of you want to respond to Petra's questions by chance?
Gotta read them again.
Okay, I was just going to suggest that I do that. Well, the first question is what is unique about Black Catholic education, because it seems to me that it does have this long history that has been very powerful. And despite the Catholic Church in many ways supporting segregation and ultimately buying into the racism of the day, Blacks continue to be drawn to the Catholic Church and to developing institutions. So I believe there's something unique within Black Catholic education. So that was one. How did it, and in what ways did it provide resilience for the Black community? And what I also see it perhaps not so much as a religion, although it certainly is, but also as a site for political activism. And I think most of the histories focus more on the religious aspect rather than on the ways in which the Catholic Church, its culture, its institutions were sites that Blacks could appropriate as a vehicle for political activism. And this is very complex. So I think it's a rich area to tease out. And of course, the overriding question is the one of how do the histories that you are developing, how do they challenge the dominant narratives of educational history? How would we rewrite? I know that's a really big question. But how might we rethink or envision that dominant narrative of educational history, which basically begins with the Common School movement, and by doing so excludes Black education prior to that, and that we didn't have a chance. But I mean, as Jari points out, so many of the schools among Black educators were small private schools, and of course there were many of these that were started, in the early 1800s as a result of the Haitian Revolution and the influx of the Haitian refugees, many of whom established small schools. So you really do have this long history of Black Catholic and secular education well before the Common School movement. But by starting the history of public education with the Common School movement, all of this previous history is effectively marginalized. And of course, they are never constituted as public, and Catholic schools are never termed as public, which is another way to exclude them from the dominant narratives and to marginalize them and the important work that they did and the political work that they did.
I would just say that I think Libby's work really speaks to what you're talking about, in that in order to investigate these schools and these religious communities further, it requires scholars to look beyond institutional Catholic archives in many cases. It is just by happenstance that the work that Libby has pulled from the Couvent material at the Archdiocese of New Orleans and that Mary Mitchell has done, that they survive because they were records of an independent board, assignment books, the famed 1850 letter books of the students. It is by happenstance that they exist within the institutional archdiocesan archives because they're not Catholic school records per se. The records of Medard Nelson, survive at Tulane, a non-sectarian institution of all places. So I think expanding beyond what we envision as Catholic education and Catholic institutions today, which is largely the regulated parish-based model that we find in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is very important. And the only other two thoughts that I would offer would be lay leadership, including leadership by lay women, I think has been so important to the Black Catholic experience. I'm thinking of places like Catholic Hill in South Carolina, which existed for over a century without clerical attention, without any attention by priests at all, due to lay leadership. Although that has been limiting because we know that unlike Baptist, Methodist, and other faiths, where Black men and later Black women had the opportunity to enter the ordained ministry, this was not largely available to Black men until post-World War II, and really in large numbers not until the 1960s. And so when you look at the organized or the civil rights movement with which we're most familiar, you do see an absence sometimes of Black priests, Black deacons, Black religious sisters even, and it's only because their numbers were so small.
Yeah, to add to Jari's point that I think that looking at sources that are not an traditional Catholic institution is very, very important, and also looking at records that are not located in the United States. Look at the sources outside the United States. I think there are many more resources that are there, and we haven't just found it. And I think that would add to our understanding of Black education in Louisiana, because people always coming in and coming out, and they don't always stay in Louisiana for their entire life. So I think that would further complex the narrative of Black Catholic education. But also at the same time, because of the, I think that as a non-Catholic member of this panel, I don't want to really go further into that. But also, I think as an outsider of the Catholic community, I think one of the unique point about Catholicism is that you always need to get involved with white priest or white lay persons in order to carry out what they want to do as persons of color, and whether they are enslaved or not. And I think that negotiation is always it's oftentimes oppression, and I don't think I personally think Pacific War was not like superstar to that tried to break the racial barrier of the early 20th century Louisiana. There are certain racism within him that he had within himself too, I think, but also at the same time, because of the constant negotiation that Black Catholic needed to have with white priest and white lay person, there are always some certain cracks that they were able to go into and get what they want. So I think that is very unique from like non-Catholic point of view. I hope it makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, that made perfect sense. I'll just add quickly with the Catholic institution is this interesting example because Creoles themselves actually refer to it as the public school of the 3rd District,
right?
Even though they were paying taxes that went to schools that were only for white children, state-sponsored schools, and so then they had their own school, and they referred to it as public school. And then they did actually receive some money from the state in a few years around the late 1850s and early 1860s. But then, the Civil War and Reconstruction kind of changes everything, where they really place this emphasis. These same activists, the same teachers and former students of the Catholic institution place this emphasis on what we would call today, what we think of as public schools today, and having this integrated public school. And of course, part of that was that the school board was integrated. Like they were, there's going to be equality and integration across the board, ideally. And so when that just totally crumbles on them, the Catholic institution kind of limped along, and then they, come back to it and say, okay, wait, if we have to have our own institution, let's build this one back up. So yeah, I think it's interesting to think about what we mean when we say public schools and how we define that.
Well, it looks like we are out of time. So I want to thank all of our speakers today for fabulous presentations. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in and listening to these great papers. And I hope to see some of you all in person in the future.
Let's hope.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
I do hope you are all thinking of putting this into an edited collection on Black Catholic education. My suggestion.
Great idea.
Thank you.
You've got 3 strong papers, a few more, and you've got a book.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. Hope to see you all soon in New Orleans.
I know.
Yeah. I wish I can visit you soon.
Yeah. Where's the SHA going to be next year?
I think
Do
it's
they know
Baltimore.
Baltimore.
Oh.
Somewhere like that.
Oh.
Yes,
That's
in
what I
Baltimore.
thought, yeah.
It's in
Yeah.
Baltimore.
That would be
Right.
fun too.
Yes.
Not
Would.
as fun as you were,
Yeah.
or not as easy. I guess.
Right.
No.
You all received a few thank yous in the chat box in case you missed those.
Thank you,
Oh,
guys.
wonderful. Oh, wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm trying to figure out how I exit out of this.
Yeah.
I think it's up at the top. It says leave.
Yeah. You see where the I says 14.
I don't see
Yeah.
that at all.
So at the very top it says recording, and then it has some numbers, and then it says leave in red.
Ah, there we go. I've got it now. All right. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
You too.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Bye.